As a public historian, I often face the question, what differentiates public history from regular history? The definitions of the field vary from, quote, historical studies outside the academy to, in the case of the National Council of Public History, quote, the many and diverse ways in which history is put to work in the world, end quote. To me, public history prioritizes bringing to life a historical narrative that will evoke a reaction in a modern reader. It's explaining that ancient Romans had takeout not unlike our own. It's showing that crises undergone today, whether sexual harassment from neighbors or forced self-isolation to prevent contagion, aren't anything new. In fact, they have ancient precedents. Essentially, public history makes a reader feel less alone, giving them a kinship, however occasionally fictive, with people of the past. Readers can understand that years and geography may change, and their circumstances may not be in direct relation or descended from the aforementioned examples, but time doesn't always alter the human desire to fight with your siblings if they annoy you, or indeed be awful to someone else. In this presentation, I will take you to Syria of 4,000 years ago, where a series of primary documents show women fighting for their places in society while navigating complicated familial dynamics. In the early 18th century BCE and the ancient Near East, a series of powerful kings dominated what is known as Sumer. They expanded their territories beyond city-states. Monarchs collected clients, vassals, and allies, often, as we can see right here, in relatively close proximity to one another, and brought these people and lands into the fold by trade, conquest, intermarriage, or any number of other methods. Jostling for power was common, and turnover of monarchs was high. Perhaps the most famous of these warring and often legislatively inclined kings was one Hammurabi of Babylon. And indeed, you can see Babylon is located right here. Indeed, Hammurabi was actually only one of several contemporaneous kings called Hammurabi in this period, which is the so-called Old Babylonian period from about 2000 to 1600 BCE. However, Hammurabi didn't operate alone. He operated within a powerful network of regional kings with heft of their own, such as the kings of the city of Mari, which is located to the northwest, which is up here. It is on Zimri Lim, Hammurabi's contemporary king of Mari, that we will cast our light today. Zimri Lim's city of Mari boasted an extensive palace complex at this time, and a good relationship with Babylon, although that eventually went sour and ended up in Hammurabi sacking and burning the city of Mari. What distinguishes Zimri Lim from his contemporaries is the sheer preponderance of primary sources we have dating to his reign, an archive of diplomatic letters in cuneiform script written on clay tablets. Similar libraries may well have existed in other contemporary cities' archives, and indeed we do have collections of diplomatic correspondence and personal correspondence from other cities around this time. However, they may not have survived in the sheer numbers that the library from Mari or the archives from Mari survived, which number about 17,000 to 22,000 tablets, depending on your calculations, found in Mari. Indeed, by burning Mari and the letters left behind as he sacked the city, Hammurabi wound up preserving these clay tablets for future generations to read. Here we have a map of the palace of Mari after Malamat in 1984's sketch, which is in turn based on the original French excavations. Now excavated by the French in the 1930s, Mari and its palace indeed contained 17,000 to 22,000, as previously mentioned, pieces of correspondence between monarchs, officials, spies, wives, daughters, governors, and more, written in the ancient Near Eastern lingua franca of Akkadian, in many cases, most cases. The archives were indeed part of the palace, at least where the texts were found. Many of them were part of the palace complex. You will see two red arrows here. Those indicate two of the three of rooms 133 to 135, which yielded hundreds of letters. We see in purple here room 115, which yielded the most of any single palace room, 4,000 letters. However, room 100, which is not shown on this map, yielded hundreds of letters written to or received by women, which has led some scholars to posit that the women's quarters were located nearby. With many wives, concubines, children, and alliances to maintain, perhaps no ancient Near Eastern monarch had a terribly peaceful home life. But the Mari archives provide us with first-person glimpses into Zimri-Lim's complex family dynamic, even once his children left home. He seemingly had more daughters than he knew what to do with, or how to deal with them, and married some of them to vassals and allies to secure support. Once the princesses were out of the palace, they still corresponded regularly with their father, advising him on current events, sending him their interpretations of their prophetic dreams, and asking for his help. Royal women could and did occupy positions of significant power in many Mesopotamian royal courts. Zimri-Lim not only corresponded with his daughters, but also with his chief wife and queen, Shibtu, who was the daughter of his ally, Yakhdun-Lim, who ruled over Halab, which is now Aleppo. Shibtu helped govern Mari in her husband's absence occasionally and reported regularly to her spouse. Daughters would often serve as their father's eyes and ears in the courts of their husbands and could presumably be hoped to be staunch voices for their father's rights and interests in the courts of their husband, in the household of their husband, even if those sons-in-law sometimes wavered in their support for said father-in-law. Now here we have two pieces from the Old Babylonian period. This is the top of a statue, the head of a statue that dates to the Old Babylonian period, and here we have two nursing women side by side, also dating to the same period. And this side-by-side image in particular made me think of sisters, perhaps, of rivals, perhaps, not from Mari, but as we see, two side-by-side women from Mari did indeed bear children around the same time and quite frankly competed for affections and position in one particular area. So we turn to the affairs of two squabbling sisters, both daughters of Zimri-Lim, named Shima-Tum and Kiru. Both women were married to the same man, Hayashumu, king of Ilan-Shura, possibly to make doubly sure a powerful vassal, like Hayashumu, remain loyal. Now, it's also possible that Shima-Tum may have suffered from epilepsy, which is referenced in another letter, so perhaps her father feared that she may not have been well enough to bear her husband an heir, and so therefore sent another daughter. It's a possibility. We do know that despite the two wives that were daughters of this king, Hayashumu's fealty wavered. Mari's ambassador to Ilan-Shura, Yamshum, wrote to Zimri-Lim that he told Hayashumu, quote, "So I rose and said, when it comes to your fault, you never admit it's mine. While you have now married two of my lord's daughters, yet you have heaped insults on my lord." Perhaps Hayashumu's relationship with his father-in-law wasn't helped by the dispute between Shima-Tum and Kiru. These internecine struggles for power and subsequent complaints to their father for aid are easily recognizable in content and tone by any parent or anyone indeed with an argumentative sibling then or now. Here we have a map of the lands that fell under the sphere of Mari. We can see Mari down here, and Ilan-Shura is believed to have been up here. So you can see that while it is a significant distance away, it still falls within the larger sphere of Zimri-Lim's control, or at least his influence. Now, while some women may have been happy to have a sister present at a foreign court, Shima-Tum and Kiru didn't appear to feel that way. Instead, each of them sent letter after letter to their father, requesting that their father make each of them the official queen and wife of Hayashumu with his influence their husband to elevate each of them, either one of them, each was arguing on her own behalf, to be Hayashumu's queen. Now, may have created a little bit of friction at home, one can imagine, definitely created friction in the royal household at Ilan-Shura. In one letter, Kiru referenced a previous note from Zimri-Lim, who wanted her to come home to practice particular religious rites. She said she was too important for her husband to let her go. After all, she did hold an official position in her husband's government, and possibly bestowed upon her by her father, and her husband was away. However, she didn't hesitate to ask her father to help her, indeed to prevent her feelings from being hurt. She wrote, quote, My father and lord should set me upon a queen's throne. Act to avoid hurting my feelings. It is upon you I depend. End quote. The candor here is remarkable. Kiru asks her father to elevate her in order that she won't get upset, and also tells her father that she relies on him. Perhaps she felt herself deserving of the role of queen because of her political role in Ilan Shura, which may have been of a governor or ambassador of sorts. We are not exactly sure what that may have entailed, but she had already had a certain position of power at court, and that may have been a basis upon which she wanted to further build her authority. Here we have a cuneiform tablet from Zimri-Lim's palace. This is beautifully preserved and is currently in the Louvre. So if you're lucky enough to be in Paris sometime soon, then definitely to go check these out. Meanwhile, Shimatum didn't waste any time, writing to Daddy Dearest to request the same thing as her sister. She asked, quote, "Another matter. Why do they continue to slander me before my lord? Moreover, incredible charges against me are proposed in my lord's presence. Yet another matter. My lord should send me a seal. He must not refuse it for me." Professor Jack Sasson suggests that the cylinder seal in question would have been a symbol of authority vested in Shimatum by her father, perhaps inscribed with writing declaring her to be a queen, indicating that when she put her seal, literal seal of approval, onto a document, that would have been included symbolically the royal authority of her father and indeed perhaps her husband. Kiru retaliated by upping the stakes and virtually requiring Zimri-Lim to act. She implied she was in danger from her husband if her father didn't declare his support for her. She intimated that Hayashima was violent, having possibly killed a man, possibly a servant of hers named Dimri Hamu. She also intimated that she'd only be secure against her wrathful spouse if her position was made official. Her allegations of being in danger are independently corroborated by Yamshum, who was the Mari ambassador to the city of Ilan Shura. Yamshum wrote to Zimri-Lim that Hayashima had threatened to kill Kiru if she didn't accompany him on a specific journey. Now the next move was Shimatum's. She staked her claim to be queen by producing twins, a son and a daughter. But not to be outdone in this chess game, Kiru then gave birth to a son of her own. Both sisters had produced heirs, yet neither apparently had yet emerged victorious over the other. Shimatum and Kiru seemed to quarrel over everything, down to who got to boss around a particular master gardener. Though Shimatum sweetly claimed in her correspondence that the two had come to a bit of a détente. Around the same time, she again wrote home to her father, requesting a lapis lazuli seal, perhaps to imprint her status as queen and to establish her authority. So things may have calmed down on the home front, but each woman was still seeking out larger authority. At a certain point, matters in Ilan Shura go from troubled and there being a rivalry to downright troublesome. Kiru told her father she had been put on house arrest. In a pathos-filled missive designed to evoke a paternal response, seemingly, she wrote, quote, "In a fancy house, I am held until death, as you already know. I am now sending the hair from my skull and the tatters that are from my body, handing them to the care of the carrier of this letter," end quote. Kiru added that Hayashima planned to kill her if her father didn't bring her back to Mari. Now, she also alleged that Shimatum deprived her of all of her attendance on the orders of their mutual husband. And indeed, Shimatum said that she didn't care what might be done to her sister Kiru because Shimatum herself was going to do whatever she wanted to Kiru. Kiru added, quote, "If my lord plans to leave me here rather than fetch me, I will surely die and not survive." Now, scholars have discussed where Kiru's loyalties may have lied. Her loyalties to her father were certainly secure and may have vexed her husband. Indeed, extant records never show them getting along swimmingly. Meanwhile, it's possible that Shimatum may have been able to balance her loyalties between her father and her husband a little more successfully. Indeed, Yamshum, the ambassador from Ilan Shura to Mari, reported to Zimri-Lim that Shimatum publicly denounced her father, saying, quote, "Another matter about Shimatum who so slanders my lord, that my lord faced God on her account. The God of my lord mutilated her fingers and epilepsy is plaguing her," end quote. Despite openly distancing herself from her father, Shimatum may have cast herself in with her lot with her husband, but she did keep up her correspondence with him and still provided advice to her father in her letters. So she may have publicly proclaimed her support for her husband, which may have smoothed things over at home, yet we do know she maintained a relationship, a diplomatic relationship, and perhaps indeed a personal one with her father. Now, this beautiful statue here would have been one of the things that possibly Kiru was coming home to. It is a beautiful statue of a water goddess from the palace of Mari, and actually would have functioned as a fountain as well. So you have water coming up through the statue of a water goddess, which is doubly liquid, if you will. And the back of the statue, which is not pictured here, is you can see the water flowing up through where the water would flow up through the back of this lovely fountain. Now, speaking of the palace of Mari, this is a scene from the investiture of Zimri-Lim, a beautiful, intricate scene that has survived in bits and pieces, and we can see perhaps how the king may have regarded how power was bestowed upon him by the divine, and how he may have interacted ceremonially with some of the subjects he ruled. But Kiru wasn't done yet, despite her conflicts with her sister. She sent another note in very disturbing terms to her father. She wrote, quote, "My life is ebbing away and constantly listening to Shimatum's words. If my lord does not fetch me back to Mari, I shall grasp at my nose and jump from the roof," end quote, which is language that is not even threatening to harm herself, but being very explicit about how she might do it, which one can imagine may have well provoked a tense response in her father or anyone else who may have read it, and is indeed quite desperate sounding. Eventually, Hayashimu symbolically divorced Kiru in public, cutting her garments and telling her to go home. Her attendant was also dismissed and reassigned to Shimatum, which may have been seen as another insult. Though the marriage was effectively over, the humiliation seemingly continued. In another letter, Kiru noted that her servants told her they no longer honored her as their lady. Shimatum may have effectively won. We have no more correspondence from Kiru, but in a letter from Zimri-Lim to his queen, the aforementioned Shibtu, he wrote that he planned to fetch Kiru home from Ilanshura. It's likely he went, or perhaps he sent men to get his daughter back, but later correspondence indicated that Hayashimu didn't seem so eager to let her go. Perhaps he didn't want to return her dowry. We're not exactly sure of the circumstances, or indeed what happened to Kiru, although one could surmise that she may well have come home to Mari. It's also likely that Shimatum may have stayed on as queen. Now, such sisterly rivalries, albeit in a palace 4,000 years ago, are reminiscent of any sibling relationship one might see. The fighting for parental attention, fighting for, supremacy in a particular political situation, if both siblings are politicians. Really, the rivalry and some of the entreating a parent to favor each individual sibling could be seen in any family relationship from then or now. The circumstances of the argument's claim may change. Maybe you aren't in a palace, but you might just be as inclined to tell your parent why they should support you, not your sibling, if in a particular endeavor. The nature of sibling rivalries indeed can be sometimes universal. In terms of public history, these women are somewhat reminiscent of the way female politicians may be regarded until the modern era. Operating in terms of the men around them, both asking for permission, and their roles are defined by what is bestowed on them, whether it is their husband or father giving them authority as chief queen or indeed as a governor. And indeed, we often see in the way in which female politicians are discussed as the daughters and wives or subordinates or proteges of powerful men. Now, in this case, unfortunately, we don't know enough about these women in their own right to define them on their own without any mention of the men around them. However, we've clearly been able to establish that they are important women that were operating and jockeying for authority and were diplomats of some sort representing their father or their native city's interest in foreign courts, that they were operating as a type of politician. Indeed, I wish I could have met them to see what their thoughts on this might have been. And whether or not they pitted themselves against one another or originally were pitted against one another is up for debate. But at the same time, if they were pitted against one another, that offers some potential comparisons even further. Now, elite royal women, powerful and perhaps educated to a certain degree, would have been definitely exceptions to the rule of most Mesopotamian women. However, seeing their struggles to wield power of their own, both in relation to and in spite of the men around them, is something that is all too familiar today. Thank you.